finally, in this session, from discovery to clinical, we're now going to get the patient perspective, and our next speaker, Alastair Kent, is providing us with a perspective of many hundreds or thousands of patients, I would imagine. Alastair is the director of the Genetic Alliance in the UK, which is a national charity of over 180 patient organisations. He's also chair of Rare Disease UK, which is a national alliance for people with rare diseases. And he's really worked in this field for a very long time in representing patient interests in numerous different areas. So we look forward to your talk.
Right, well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to be here, and as you see, my title for this talk is about putting patients on the discovery team. We've heard from previous speakers, we have an unprecedented capacity to generate data, but turning that data from a mass of isolated facts into information, into knowledge, into the opportunity for action, into interventions that will then be used to improve the healthcare of patients and families with life-limiting disorders, is something that you can't do without us, without the patients. And why should you do it? Well, just let me remind you that you may be sitting here as a scientist, as a clinician, as an academic, as a regulator, or whatever. But I hate to have to tell you that your current good health is simply an incomplete diagnosis. And it may well be that at some point you're going to be dependent on the sort of skills, knowledge, and insights that are being generated by your work, translated into opportunities for interaction through our engagement. So basically, why should you involve patients in your research? Well, the first issue is that it helps you to understand the question. Most rare diseases, indeed many complex common diseases, are not as well understood, not as well characterized, not as well recorded as we would like them to be. So, you don't know as an individual clinician, because you only see a small proportion of the people who have that, particularly if it's a rare disease. You don't know whether the patient sitting opposite you, the fact that they're winking at you constantly, is part of their syndrome, or do they just fancy you? And it's only when you put together that data, that experience, which you gather from patients, that you can begin to see what the syndrome is. It also helps to define the question. What's the problem you're trying to solve? There are aspects of diseases that really screw up our lives as patients, and there are things we can live with. Now, if you're going to make a clinical impact, we'd like you to concentrate on those aspects that screw up our lives, rather than using scarce resources to address some of the less important issues around the condition. And thirdly, it's to plan the strategy. Funnily enough, we were not put on this earth to give you interesting things to do. And we'd quite like your research to take account of our lives and the way in which we want to live them. And if you do that, then we can help you recruit the volunteers, the people who will participate in your research, and help to validate the outcomes. You thought that was going to happen. Well, it did, and my life improved as a result, which in turn helps to secure the implementation of the knowledge, of the opportunities to intervene that you create through your work into clinical practice, so it can go on and have that wider effect. We can also contribute aspects to the setting of priorities. James Lind Alliance has this process called priority setting partnerships, where they bring patients and clinicians together to work on the things that most matter, the most important research questions. Scientists are excluded from that, because what's interesting to a scientist may not be extremely important to the patients or the clinicians. So it helps to promote that kind of dialogue between the scientists and the patients and the clinicians. We can bring money. Muscular Dystrophy UK invested large quantities of money in mitochondrial research, but when it was a very unlikely hypothesis that warranted investigation. That proved the possibility of doing something useful, and that now has been picked up by many other funders, so it started things going. And the AKU, the Alkaptonuria Society, crowdfunded a clinical trial for repurposing a drug which is looking very promising for black bone disease. We can also contribute to the generation of registries, whether these are publicly funded one like Public Health England's National Congenital Anomaly and Rare Disease Registration Service, or disease-specific ones, such as, for example, in the UK, one run by the Mucopolysaccharide Disease Societies. Patients, families with rare diseases particularly, are generally very enthusiastic about registers. You know, they will support because we actually want you to share your data, the data that we give to you, in a way that is responsible and useful, because we get fed up of having to tell our story over and over again to people who we thought would talk to each other. We can also contribute to the recruitment to your studies. DDD is Diagnosing Developmental Delay, Genomics England, two big studies in the UK, which worked with our Syndromes Without a Name peer-to-peer support service to bring families in, to volunteer, to recruit, to participate, to join in through the Genomics Medicine Centres and through the Wellcome Trust campus, to build the critical mass that allowed for the generation of data and information more quickly and more thoroughly. We bring realism. You know, families often don't understand why things take so long. So being part of a community of patients can help them to, you know, realize that maybe you're not going to get a result tomorrow. Maybe it's not going to be for months or possibly even years. But given that you know what's going on, then the engagement is sustainable, and you get peer-to-peer support, so people are supported and enabled to continue to participate, even if the results are not as immediately apparent. And we can also help with the transition from research into clinical use. There's a scheme for translating the sequencing of free fetal DNA through non-invasive prenatal diagnosis into clinical practice. We were part of a process that helped the realistic communication of what this new technology could bring about to families at risk, so they understood and could make an informed decision about whether they wanted it, and more importantly, about whether they thought it was a good idea, and so able to influence the policymakers and the planners to bring this into clinical use. We ran a citizens' jury, you know, looking at implementation about the delivery of new knowledge into licensed products. And that involved 16 patients or carers with life-limiting diseases. And the crucial thing from that is that patients wanted to have a say on the benefit-risk calculation. You know, not all benefits are equally valuable. Not all risks are equally acceptable. You know, if you look, for example, at families where there are boys with Duchenne muscular dystrophy, there's a product just been licensed through the European Medicines Agency, through the FDA, which looked, amongst other things, as a hard endpoint at the 6-minute walk test. Now, going off your feet for a boy with Duchenne is a huge event, no doubt about it. But there are alternatives. You know, you can go into a wheelchair, which will, in some cases, actually increase your mobility, will enable you to do more because you are not using your limited reserves of energy to walk about. But what really matters to the boys with Duchenne is the ability to use their hands, because that way they can interact with their keyboards, with their mobile phones, with their iPads, with social media. They can broaden their social engagement in ways that, you know, being able to get about physically in the environment doesn't permit to the same extent. But there's no 6-minute hand function test. So maybe you should, be thinking about developing more patient-relevant outcomes for the research. Also, there are other important elements that need to be taken into account there, which time the clock is ticking here. It's quite oppressive, really. I think I'll ignore it. Looking at the design of research is, you want us to participate with you. So, take account of our lives and the things that, make it possible for us to contribute. I'll give you another example. There was a study in Leeds not so long ago. It's nothing to do with genomics. It's about dentition in elderly people. Now, if you are in your late 80s, then and you are quite likely, certainly in the UK, to have false teeth. If your false teeth don't fit, then your nutrition will be affected and you're more likely to have all sorts of, other health effects. So this study was looking at how well false teeth fit and what impact that has. And the researchers were having huge problems recruiting elderly people to come and participate. And they were giving them lunch. But they had neglected, until they started asking, the people they wanted to recruit, well, why aren't you coming? And say, well, look, my bus pass doesn't kick in until after 9:30 in the morning. So if you want me there for 9 o'clock, I have to pay a bus fare. And I'm a pensioner, I'm poor. So start it after 9:30 and I'll come. Fine. And they said, and another thing, you give us lunch, and then you ask us questions and then you turn us out at 3:30 in the afternoon. Well, I don't know how many of you have recently been on a British bus at 3:30 in the afternoon when the secondary schools turn out. They are a seething mass of teenage hormones. And frankly, if you're not too steady on your feet and you're walking with sticks or a Zimmer or something, getting on a bus in that sort of, the gutters are awash with testosterone. It's a frightening environment to be. So, think about the context within which you want to do your research, as well as what it is you actually want to investigate. And you will find you will get more people joining you more quickly. They'll stay with you. They'll give you better quality information. They'll deliver results more quickly, more cheaply, and more affordably. We also looked at the importance of psychological and social factors and the need to support participation, especially where you're looking at researching children because think about the impact on the rest of the family. Think about the disruption that it causes to family life. If you're recruiting for a clinical trial program with a rare disease, you're probably bringing people possibly from far afield in your own country, but maybe across national boundaries. So think about how you can make it easier for people to participate. And this wasn't just a sort of random musings of 16 patients and carers in the UK. We surveyed 600 families across Europe, and they all said the same thing in different languages. The best drug in the world is useless if it doesn't get to the patients who need it. Patients have no interest in drugs that don't work, but we have a huge interest in interventions that will change our lives for the better. So we need an appropriate regulatory environment and timely reimbursement decisions to be made, so we can stand to benefit from the brilliance of your creativity, your inspiration, and your effort. And there are the old randomized, double-blind, large-scale, placebo-controlled, whatever, multi-center clinical trial with 10,000 patients in it is not appropriate for what you're doing. So if you come along to the regulators, we need to have a regulatory framework that recognizes how you're going to prove quality, safety, and efficacy of the thing that you've created, but also how it's going to demonstrate to hard-pressed healthcare systems that it's worth committing resources to. And that means, a number of initiatives, such as the ones that I've outlined here, and I'm really not going to talk about those because that would keep you from your lunch for far too long. So the aim is to create a virtuous circle. If we and you and the regulators and the industry and the healthcare planners and the politicians and all those other interested stakeholders can work together, then we will attract resources. You know, it will be seen to be an important issue to be addressed. Rare diseases traditionally have been categorized as, rare, not very many people affected, not much we can do about it, bit difficult to sort it out, so let's do something more important. But in a context of the NHS in England, approximately, I think it's about £15 billion. John, I think that's right, isn't it, national commissioning? £15 billion of a total NHS budget of £120 billion in England is spent directly supporting services for patients who have rare diseases. About 3.5 million people in the UK. So bringing them together and creating that critical mass attracts the resources and makes sure that it's more likely that you will get a bigger healthcare bang for the bucks spent. It'll increase the relevance because you will know that you're trying to answer the questions that matter. It will facilitate the partnerships because we actually want you to work together. You know, we want to get to a point where I can come into a clinic and say, well, who are you working with on this? Why aren't you sharing your data? Why aren't you collaborating? Why aren't you building joint ventures? And that will hasten the process because you will more quickly get the information you need to understand what's going on. It will also help to secure dissemination because we will be talking to commissioners. We will be talking to commissioners, to people who plan health services, you know, about the opportunity to deliver health gain to people like us. And that will increase the uptake, which will make it more likely that that resource-generating process will continue to turn so that you will be able to do the next thing that you matter and demonstrate the added value that we have for healthcare systems. Because, you know, it's not like you're not spending money on us already, but we'd quite like you to spend that money smarter, to get better results by coordinating, by working together, by bringing together your expertise and generating innovative solutions that will improve our outcomes. So it's time for a change. You know, we need to be seen as partners in the process. You know, the old hierarchical model where scientists invented, industry created, doctors prescribed, and we took and were grateful whether it worked or not, doesn't work any longer. We need to be partners because we have expertise that we bring to the party just like you do. It's different expertise. We're not guinea pigs. We're not there to give you interesting things to do. We have a say and a voice in this process. And as I said, you know, good health is just an incomplete diagnosis. We are all worth it, and we must sustain the effort. John Byrne often shows a slide of his son planting an acorn in the garden because he wanted somewhere to have his tree house. Well, the next slide shows the tree house in the tree that has grown from that acorn. It's a sustainable process. It won't happen tomorrow, but by working together, we can make sure that the engagement, the interest, the commitment to development is there for the time that it will take to deliver the benefits for patients that your insights are creating today and which will be tomorrow's healthcare improvement that will change the lives of patients and families with currently intractable diseases for the better across the world. So as John Ebden, now sadly deceased broadcaster on the BBC always used to end up, if you have been, thank you for listening. And from me, if you have been, thank you for listening.
Questions for Alastair? Well, I will. One thing I find when one is advocating to government for investment in specific areas, and particularly, as you said, rare disease is sometimes not an attractive investment. is that you're trying to balance with government to make a case for cost effectiveness versus the concept of a public good or quality of life, and whether you could comment on how your group has dealt with that discrepancy.
Yeah, we've just actually a couple of weeks ago published results of a pilot study which we call the hidden cost of rare diseases. Now, if you are developing an intervention that is at the cutting edge of knowledge, that is only going to be beneficial to a small number of patients in a community, that is difficult to manufacture, to develop, then it is likely to be expensive in terms of the cost per patient treated. But you need to look at the cost to the health service as a whole, rather than focusing back down on cost per patient. A word of advice to you: if you're going to be sick, and I would try and avoid that if I were you, but if you are, pick a disease that's common as dirt, that's got an intervention that works 100% of the time, every time, that's well understood, that has no side effects, and costs tuppence a ton. Don't choose to have a rare disease that's expensive, that's poorly understood, that there's little, because there's no kudos in it. It just screws your life up. So, but you have to look at the cost, the impact of the condition in its entirety. We tend to focus too much on silo budgets and the impact on silo budgets. I mean, I was talking to, sorry, I'm going off onto another talk here, but yeah.
Well, we have three questions, so I will stop you there.
Yeah, Mark Williams-Geisinger. So from the United States perspective, I wanted to mention that in the rare disease space, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, or PCORI, actually as part of their legislative mandate, is mandated to spend a certain percentage of their money on rare disease. Now, PCORI requires evidence of patient partnerships up to and including having patients as investigators on the research project. But I can also say that the number of applications that they've had that have come in the rare disease space has been not sufficient to actually meet their requirements to disperse funds. So this is a real opportunity, I think, for the rare disease community to think about this particular model. And I can just tell you from our organization that having actually pursued that model, not only has it made us successful in terms of competing for the funds, but it was really eye-opening for us for all the reasons that you articulated about how important it is to have patients present at the inception of the research question to really inform project design, and then have partnerships with them all through the completion of the project. And now at our place, investigators now have to defend why patients are not involved as investigators, as opposed to trying to defend why you have patients involved into the IRB.
Yeah, and that's absolutely right. And I think the question for us is to think about how we can invest in capacity building for patient organizations and in making the system more permeable to the patient perspective. If you go into many committees which are looking at grant applications or evaluating project reports or whatever, sitting around the table will be a number of people who are paid to be there because that's what their job is. As a patient advocate, you may be there because you've had to take a day off work. You're the only one there. It's probably the only time that you will participate in that sort of committee. So there's a huge onus on you as a volunteer, as somebody who perhaps doesn't share a common language with the rest of the committee, to make your voice heard. We need to invest in improving the capacity and the capability of patient organizations, but also in improving the ability of professionals to listen to and to hear what patients are saying.
Alastair, thank you for bringing a dose of realism, as usual, to the argument, because I think it's very important that we come back and ground ourselves in reality. The question that came out of a discussion we had yesterday in relation to patients' attitudes in relation to data sharing and that perhaps Peter Capitaine might want to comment on this as well, that actually maybe we're complicating things when patients are actually saying, and there's evidence there now in terms of online communities coming together and actually saying we want to share our data. So maybe both from the scientific viewpoint but also from the regulatory viewpoint, we're actually complicating things when actually if we worked more with the patients, we could actually get a lot more done a lot more quickly. What's your comments on that?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. You know, from our experience working with our members, they actually, go into the process with the naive assumption too often that you will actually talk to one another. It's only when you've been trying to navigate the healthcare system, and you realize that you are the principal channel of communication between doctors and scientists and others, that you realize that, it doesn't work like that in practice. And I think you're absolutely right. We do need to create an expectation that information, that communication will flow between people. And we don't do that by, pretending we can make this perfectly secure environment because, we know that data leaks, that it will be hacked. If you can hack Hillary Clinton's emails, you can probably hack, my medical records if you want to enough. Won't tell you anything interesting, but, there you go. You're welcome to try. The thing is that, we create the confidence that allows you to share your information, not by pretending that we can create this perfectly secure environment, but, making sure that if it does leak, that it is used for what is generally regarded as an inappropriate person. The leaker and the person to whom it is leaked never get the opportunity to do it again because, the system is policed and there are sanctions in place to prevent or to mitigate the risk of abuse.
Thanks, Alastair.
Thank you. So thanks to Alastair, Kim and Heidi for a great session, and off to lunch.